The sheep and goat judgment of the nations. Judgment Day is the last day in history, and it involves various judgments. The judgment of individuals, the judgment of towns, regions, and also nations. Matthew chapter 25 gives us some detail about the judgment of the nations. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats, and he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on his left. From Scripture we know that some nations will survive into the millennial period, and we also know that some nations have already been destroyed. Zechariah chapter 14 tells us that the nations will go up to Jerusalem to worship the King. If they don't go, they shall be punished. Zechariah chapter 14 verse 17. And it shall be that whosoever will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. However, we don't know exactly which nations will survive the judgment and which will be destroyed. There are some clues though. If you've seen my video on the 153 fish, you will know that in my opinion the fish represent the 153 nations of the world. The disciples were to be fishers of men. Matthew chapter 4 verse 18 to 19. And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brethren, Simon called Peter and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he saith unto them, Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. The fish are all the people groups in the world. When counting up the 153 nations, I noticed that 1/3 of them were born in disobedience to God. 2/3 were born according to his perfect will. The following chart shows that the nations come from 3 patriarchs, Noah, Abraham, and Seir the Horite. So you can see Noah's 3 sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. 14 families came from Japheth, 26 from Shem. But 18 of the families that came from Ham were not under a curse. 12 of the families that came through Ham's son Canaan were under the curse given by Noah in Genesis chapter 9:25. The other families basically were descended through Abraham. We've got his first concubine Hagar, who had 13 families came through her son Ishmael, and they were born in disobedience. We've got Sarah's 28 families from Jacob and Esau. We've got 16 families through Keturah. And then we also have 26 families through Seir the Horite, who intermarried with the descendants of Esau. The total number of families is 153. However, as you can see from the notes above, not all of them were born in obedience to God. Canaan and his 11 descendants were cursed according to Genesis 9 verse 25. Abraham married his wife's handmaid Hagar because he did not wait for God's promise of descendants to be fulfilled through his wife. Hagar's son Ishmael and his 12 descendants make up 13 families altogether. The other group of families listed in Genesis 36 that were born in disobedience were the children of Seir the Horite. Seir was a Canaanite and so was under a curse. Seir's daughters intermarried with Esau and his sons. Isaac and Rebekah, Esau's Israelite parents, were greatly disappointed that their son intermarried with Canaanites. Genesis chapter 26, verse 34 to 35. And Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Bashemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, which were a grief of mind unto Isaac and to Rebekah. So the 12 Canaanite families the 13 Ishmaelite families and the 26 families of Seir the Horite come to 51 families. This is exactly 1/3 of the total 153 families. The other 102 families were made up as follows: the sons of Noah, 14 nations through Japheth, 26 through Shem, 18 through Ham, not including the 12 Canaanite families. The sons of Abraham through Sarah, 12 through Jacob and 16 through Esau. The sons of Abraham through Keturah, 16 in all. The following chart should make things a bit clearer. So we've got families born according to God's will, making up the 102. And we've got families born out of God's will, making up 51. And that makes the 153 families altogether. You can, if you want to study this yourself, there's more information on the website with more charts. So we have 2/3 of the nations who are in God's will and 1/3 out of God's will. The 2/3 to 1/3 ratio occurs elsewhere in the Bible. 1/3 of the angels rebelled against God and followed Satan, according to Revelation chapter 12. Also, if you go through the kings of Judah, from the time when Solomon's temple was completed, the high point of Israel, to the time when Israel were taken into captivity in Babylon, there were 131.5 years when wicked kings ruled, and 263 years when righteous kings ruled, an exact 1/3 to 2/3 ratio. My point here is that when we come to the judgment of the nations, the 2/3 of the nations who are in God's will are the sheep nations, and the 1/3 who are out of God's will are the goat nations. The next question to be addressed will be the identity of the nations. The sheep and goat judgment of the nations, part 2. The identity of the 51 goat nations. Firstly, Canaan, or the Canaanites. Following on from the previous video, it is my opinion that 51 of the 153 nations are goat nations and will not survive the judgment of the nations. It's interesting to try and identify who these nations are today. Firstly, there are the 12 nations descended from Canaan and his sons. These nations were generally known for their wickedness, although there were good individuals among them. All these nations dwelt in the land of Canaan prior to the arrival of the Israelites, and according to Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 2, 6 of them plus the Perizzite nation were to be utterly destroyed. Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 2. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. The following chart gives more details of these 12 nations. Canaan and his sons are listed in the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10. Firstly, Canaan. In the Bible, the Canaanites are listed as a separate tribe from the tribes descended from the sons of Canaan. So if you look in Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 1 and 2, the tribes that have to be thrown out of Canaan are listed. The Canaanite tribe are listed as a separate tribe from the other tribes that have to be cast out. So there's 6 tribes descended from Canaan altogether that have to be cast out. That's the Canaanites themselves, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, also called the Girgashites, and the Hivites. Those are the ones that have to be thrown out of Canaan. The other ones are not mentioned as inhabiting Canaan at the time when Joshua invades Canaan. Then we've got the Sidonites. They lived in Sidon, a city in north of Israel. Tyre and Sidon were sister cities, and they were known for their opulence and wickedness. Because Israel failed to overthrow Sidon in their conquest of the Promised Land, their wickedness continued. To a Jewish audience in Jesus' day, Sidon was synonymous with wickedness. Then we have the tribes known as the Hittites, which at one time were thought to be mythical, but now archaeological discoveries have shown that they were a real nation. The Jebusites, the tribe that inhabited what became Jerusalem, the Amorites, they were known for their iniquity. The Girgashites, don't know a lot about them, and the Hivites, who dwelt in the Mount Hermon area. So those 6 nations plus the Perizzites were the ones listed that had to be cast out of Canaan. Then we have the other sons of Canaan, the Archites. It's interesting that Hushai, the Archite, was a friend of David and helped him when he was cast out of Jerusalem by Absalom. We've got the Sinites. The Sinites are interesting because historically they're connected with the Chinese. The Arvadites, they were noted as mariners in Ezekiel chapter 27 verse 8. Zemarites, and then finally we've got the Hamathites. They inhabited the kingdom of Hamath, located in what is now western Syria and northern Lebanon. So those are the Canaanite tribes. So in fact, the Canaanite nations today are the nations surrounding Israel. On a modern map, the nations bordering Israel are Lebanon, Syria, Jordan and Egypt. We know from scripture that Egypt will survive into the millennial period, Isaiah chapter 19 verse 21, and will accept Jesus as Lord. Jordan is actually part of the land promised to Israel by God, Joshua chapter 1 verse 4. Lebanon is the land with the strongest Canaanite roots. The Canaanites' DNA lives on in Lebanon, where over 90% of Lebanese derive their ancestry from Canaanites, according to a study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. Only Egypt of these nations can be assured of a future as a nation. As a general rule of thumb, those nations which have committed themselves to Islam will not survive the Matthew 25 judgment, unless at some point, as in the case of Egypt, they turn to Christ. Not all the Canaanite nations remained in Canaan. Genesis chapter 10 verse 18 says that they were spread abroad. The Sinites are an interesting case. Names such as Sinai reflect the names of Sineas or the Sinites. The Chinese are descendants of these original Sinites, and most call themselves Han, from Ham, one of Noah's 3 sons. China in ancient times was called the land of the Sinites. This name is still used, and the Bible even calls this distant land the land of Sinim. Not all the people in China are Sinites though. There are several people groups that made it to China. One group, the Mayo people, have their ancestry through Noah's son Japheth and his son Gomer. In my opinion, none of the Canaanite nations listed will survive the judgment of the nations, but this does not mean that individuals of Canaanite stock cannot be saved. There are several examples of righteous Canaanites, such as Uriah the Hittite and Hushai the Archite. We also have the example of the Gibeonites, who were a family within the Hivite nation but found a place in Israel. We can see God's grace operating in the Old Testament. The curse on the Canaanites from Noah in Genesis 9:25 was, "And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." So the cursed didn't say all Canaan's offspring were to be destroyed, just that they would be servants to their brethren. However, as a whole, the Canaanite nations always seem to have a tendency towards evil, which is why, in my opinion, they will not survive the judgment of the nations. The Matthew 25 judgment takes into account all the nations that have existed in history, even if they only existed as nation-states at one particular period in history. The next video will look at nations descended from Hagar. The Sheep and Goat Judgment of the Nations Part 3. The identity of the 51 goat nations. Hagar. We are currently looking at the 51 nations that I do not believe will survive the judgment of Matthew 25. 12 of them were the Canaanite nations. The next 12 are the offspring of Abraham's concubine Hagar through her son Ishmael. The names of these are given in Genesis chapter 25, verses 12 to 16. The offspring of Ishmael became a great nation, according to Genesis chapter 17, verse 20. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. As well as the 12 princes, there were also people who were called Ishmaelites. These were, I believe, the offspring of Esau and Ishmael's daughter Mahalath. Esau first married Canaanite women, Genesis chapter 26, verses 34 to 35. And Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Bashemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, which were a grief of mind unto Isaac and to Rebekah. When Esau saw that he displeased his parents, he married a daughter of Ishmael called Mahalath. Genesis chapter 28, verse 9. Then went Esau unto Ishmael, and took unto the wives which he had Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth, to be his wife. I believe that the offspring of Esau and Mahalath were the Ishmaelites. Edom is another name for Esau in the Bible. In Psalm 83, the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites were grouped together. Psalm 83, verse 6. The tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagarenes. So we have the nation of Ishmaelites plus the 12 nations of the princes that were Ishmael's sons, making 13 tribes altogether. These nations live in Arabia. Their names are as follows. First of all, we have the Ishmaelites, who, as I have said, I believe they're the offspring of Esau and Ishmael's daughter Mahalath. Then we've got Nebajoth or Nebaioth. They built a civilization based on merchant trade. They're mentioned as keepers of sheep in Isaiah chapter 60, verse 7. We've got Kedar. They're mentioned in several Bible passages in the Bible as nomads. They lived in Arabian Peninsula. Abdil possibly lived in the Sinai. The tribe of Abdil is often identified with the people in the land of Arubu, who became subjects to Tiglath-Pileser II. Got Mibsam in the Arabian Peninsula. Not much is known about him. Mishma, very little known about Mishma. We've got Duma. Duma is mentioned in biblical records as a city in Canaan. It's also associated with Edom and Seir in Isaiah chapter 21. We've got Massa in the Arabian Peninsula. We've got Hadar in the Arabian Peninsula, possibly in Syria. We've got Timah in the Arabian Peninsula. They're actually associated with an ancient oasis of Tamar in northwest Saudi Arabia. And then we've got the tribes of Jetah, Naphish and Kedemah that we don't know much about. So they're the 13 tribes of Ishmael, and they were all Semitic tribes, that is, descended from Shem. However, we also see in the Bible that Sheba and Dedan, brothers descended from Ham through Ramah, dwell in Arabia. Isaiah chapter 21 verse 13. The burden upon Arabia. In the forest in Arabia shall ye lodge, O ye travelling companies of Dedanim, that is Dedan. So we have the Hamitic tribes of Sheba and Dedan, along with the Semitic tribes of Ishmael, all living in the Arabian Peninsula. Sheba was the son of Ramah. He settled in northern Arabia, traded in spices, precious stones and gold. That's Ezekiel chapter 27 verse 22 and 38 verse 13. Dedan was also a son of Ramah and settled in northern Arabia. They were traders in ivory tusks and ebony. as well as clothing and blankets. That's Isaiah chapter 21 verse 13, and also mentioned in Ezekiel and First Chronicles. They traded spices by caravan along an international trade route in present-day Al-Alula, 70 miles southwest of Timur in northern Arabia. So the descendants of Sheba and Dedan are generally thought to live in Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf states. The other Arab states are mainly populated by Arabs who consider themselves to be descended from Ishmael. There is a strong connection between the Ishmael nation and Islam. And none of these Ishmaelite nations can expect to survive the Matthew 24 judgment unless they turn to Jesus. It's interesting to note that there is one Middle East state which is not Arab, and that is Iran, which was formerly Persia. The Persians are descended from Madai, a son of Joseph, son of Noah. Iran is currently a Muslim nation, but the Christian church in Iran is exploding. And Iran, or Persia, is one of the nations I would expect to survive the judgment. Finally, the angel of the Lord told Hagar what sort of person her son Ishmael would be. Genesis chapter 16 verse 12, and he will be a wild man, his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Interestingly, this is echoed in a well-known Arab Bedouin saying about themselves, I against my brothers, I and my brothers against my cousins, I and my brothers and cousins against the world. So we can see that the Ishmaelite Arabs are born to conflict. In the next video, we will look at the 26 families descended from Seir the Horite. The Sheep and Goat Judgment of the Nations, Part 4. The Identity of the 51 Goat Nations, Seir the Horite. The final group of nations are the descendants of Seir the Horite, listed in Genesis chapter 36. Seir was a Canaanite. The Horites seem to be the same people as the Hivites, as a man called Zibeon is listed as a Hivite in Genesis chapter 36 verse 2, and also as a Horite in Genesis chapter 36 verse 20. The Canaanites were the original inhabitants of Edom, the land later taken over by Esau. Esau and his sons intermarried with the Canaanite women, much to the grief of Esau's parents, Isaac and Rebekah, who were Israelites. Through this intermarriage, Seir's descendants became nations, but not godly nations. The sons of Seir were the nations descended from Seir, who intermarried with Edomites, the descendants of Esau. Some legitimate nations came from Esau. These were the 16 dukes of Edom listed in Genesis chapter 36. The illegitimate nations were the 26 sons of Seir listed in Genesis 36. The Seirites and the Edomites all lived in the Mount Seir region, which is between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. These people intermingled and became nations, but they have no eternal future. God was against the people of this region, and Ezekiel prophesied against it. Ezekiel chapter 35 verses 2 to 3. Son of man, set thy face against Mount Seir, and prophesy against it, and say unto it, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, O Mount Seir, I am against thee, and I will stretch out mine hand against thee, and I will make thee most desolate. The following chart lists the sons of Seir the Horite as listed in Genesis chapter 36. You can go through and work out that there's actually 26 descendants listed in Genesis chapter 36. So to recap, we have now been through the 51 nations that will not survive the Matthew 25 judgment of the nations. They are the nations descended from Noah's grandson Canaan, who are located throughout the Middle East. That's 12 nations. The nations descended from Hagar through her son Ishmael, who are located in North Africa and Arabia. That's 13 nations. And the nations descended from Seir the Horite. That's 26 nations. The descendants of all these nations live in the Middle East, and it is interesting that their modern counterparts have all become Islamic nations. So this chart depicts all the nations in the world that have an official state religion. The green-coloured nations are all nations that officially endorse Islam as their national religion. From this we can see that Islam is actually the religion of rebellion. According to the Pew Research Center, there are about 50 Muslim majority countries in the world, although this number varies slightly from year to year. This roughly matches the 51 nations that are not part of God's eternal plan. Every individual person in the world has the choice of whether to accept Jesus or not. However, as far as the individual nations go, some of them have no future. Sheep and Goat Judgment of the Nations Part 5. The Identity of the 102 Sheep Nations. We have been looking at the final judgment of the nations by Jesus in Matthew chapter 25. In my opinion, the Bible indicates that there are 153 nations altogether. 51 of these will be classed as goat nations and will not pass the judgment. The remaining 102 nations are sheep nations and will have an eternal future. The sheep nations fall into two categories. Firstly, the 58 nations which are listed in a table of nations in Genesis chapter 10. This table lists 70 nations, but 12 of them were Canaanite nations and were under a curse. Secondly, the 44 nations descended from Abraham's two legitimate wives, Sarah and Keturah. The nations descended from his concubine Hagar are not sheep nations. Abraham's name means father of nations. The only new nations that God created after the original nations listed in Genesis chapter 10 came through Abraham. The following table shows more detail. So we have 40 nations that came through Noah's son Japheth, who are basically the Indo-European nations. We have 26 nations who came through Noah's son Shem. They're basically the Jews and the Middle Eastern nations. The word Semitic comes from the word Shem. Then we have 18 nations from Noah's son Ham. These are the African and Asian nations. This number does not include the nations descended from Canaan and his sons. Then we have Abraham's descendants. He had a legitimate son through Sarah called Isaac. Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. 12 nations came through Jacob, that is Israel, and 16 nations from Esau, the Edomites. Then we have Abraham's descendants through Keturah, that's another 16 nations. And this makes up the 102 sheep nations in all. It's interesting to note that there are currently 156 nations in the world with a population of over 1 million. It seems that the modern nations in the world are starting to mirror the original 153 nations. About 50 of these nations are officially Islamic states, so the world today is starting to reflect the 102 to 51 split between the sheep nations and the goat nations. However, as far as specifics are concerned, the issue has not been decided yet. The state religion of Egypt is currently Islam, but according to the Bible, Egypt will at some time turn to the Lord. Also, Iran is an Islamic state, but may also turn to the Lord, as it does not historically belong to any of the goat nation families. There may also be some non-Islamic nations that turn to Islam in the future and become goat nations. I've tried to show that it is the Islamic nations that are the goat nations. It may be asked why this is, because there are many other nations that are either secular or follow other religions than Christianity. The major reason is that one of the yardsticks that Jesus uses in his judgment of the nations in Matthew chapter 25 is how the nations have treated his brethren, i.e. the Jews. Only the Islamic faith actually opposes Jews and Christians as a tenet of its faith. All Jews and Christians, the natural and spiritual brethren of Jesus, are expected to convert to the Islamic faith or die. The land of Israel itself is regarded as being assigned to Islam. Consequently, any nation that declares itself an Islamic state cannot pass the judgment of the nations. No Muslim can accept that God has a son, as the Quran denies this. This is the exact point that Satan tested Jesus on in the wilderness. Matthew chapter 4 verse 3. And when the tempter came to him, he said, If thou be the Son of God, command that these stones be made bread. Jesus always said that he was the Son of God, which is why the Pharisees accused him of blasphemy. Anyone who accepts the Islamic faith is automatically saying that Jesus was a liar. Any nation that accepts Islam will be judged by the Son of God himself. The 102 sheep nations will all accept Jesus as Lord during the millennial period and will follow him during that age. At the end of the 1,000-year millennium, Judgment Day will happen. The nations of those who are saved will continue into the age of the new heaven and the new earth, and of the new Jerusalem. Revelation chapter 21 verses 22 to 24. And I saw no temple therein, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it, and the city had no need of the sun, neither of the moon, to shine in it, for the glory of God did lighten it. And the Lamb is the light thereof, and the nations of them which are saved shall walk in the light of it, and the kings of the earth do bring their glory and honour into it. So there is an eternal future for both individuals and nations that follow Jesus. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting, you can find more information at prophecy-workshop.com.